The U.S. begins the search for those behind Tuesday's deadly attacks and gets a strong show of support from its closest allies.
Article 5 of the Charter says that an attack from abroad by any one against any member of the alliance is an attack against the alliance.
And in New York, the still smoldering ruins yield stories of horror and also survival. From CNN Center, I'm Jonathan Mann.
And I'm Relitza Vasilova. We will have new details on the investigation of the terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington in just a moment. But first, let's go right to the scene of the worst devastation, New York, where CNN's Alessio Vinci joins us live. Alessio.
Well, Relitza, there are many things, many incredible things that have happened here in the last 2 days in New York. One of them right behind me here, if you can see, even in the middle of the night, you can see the high cloud of white smoke still billowing on top of the wreckage of the two towers that collapsed after the passenger jets hit them. More than 40 hours later, still thick white smoke billowing from there, an indication how difficult it is still down there for the hundreds of rescue workers trying to remove some of the debris and try to see if perhaps somebody is still alive underneath that rubble. The workers there working on 12-hour shifts, perhaps some of them even longer. The buildings surrounding the World Trade Center very much unstable and making that rescue operation even more dangerous. We spent several hours earlier today with some of the workers there. We could see several long lines of dumpster trucks being used to take away from the area the debris. We also saw some refrigerator trucks, an indication that some of the bodies were being found and taken to the morgue. The last official count at this time is 82 bodies found. Only 16 of them have been identified. The number of casualties, of course, is set to increase once the rescue operation continues. Mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has asked the Federal Emergency Management Agency to bring 6,000 body bags here in New York. Meanwhile, the lower part of New York, south of 14th Street, remains completely sealed off by the police. A good portion of the lower Manhattan is also without electricity. That's why many people have been evacuated, especially the elderly ones. Some people also left on their own, and I've been able to speak to some people earlier today. Some people here in lower Manhattan who said that even in the wake of this catastrophe, they wanted to remain here. One person saying, looking at the sky, saying, "I cannot believe that the two towers are no longer there." Back to you, Relitza.
Alessio, also from the reports we were hearing, it's also difficult to breathe.
Absolutely, Relitza. We spent there only 20 minutes down there, about a half an hour perhaps, and after that we could really, we were really having a hard time, difficulties in breathing. There's smoke, there is dust, there is a lot of debris throughout the area where the two towers collapsed. Any kind of emergency official there or the rescue workers are all using gas masks in order to be able to sustain hours and hours of very hard work. As I said, some shifts lasting 12 hours or more without a gas mask. It would be practically impossible to remain so close to the fire, so close to the smoke, and try to bring some of the bodies out of there.
Alessio, is there still hope that survivors may be found?
Well, I spoke to some rescue workers earlier, and they said that yes, they do have hope. Certainly, they haven't found any body alive for the last several hours. We heard earlier, a couple of hours ago on CNN, one of the volunteer rescuers who was saying that so far he has only found body parts and no body, and certainly nobody alive. So there is still hope, but after more than 40 hours, and given the fact that two towers, 110 stories high, collapsed, it's really unlikely that at this point any person alive could be found. But the workers continue, and it is still a search and rescue operation.
Alessio, thank you.
The FBI says it's pursuing some 2,000 leads in its investigation of the attacks on the symbols of America's financial and military might. It says as many as 50 people may have helped plan and execute the attacks that leveled the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center and damaged the Pentagon. Among that group, the FBI says it believes between 12 and 24 hijackers commandeered the 4 jets involved, and it says investigators have identified many of those it believes hijacked the planes. Attorney General John Ashcroft calls the probe into Tuesday's attacks the most intensive investigation and the most massive in American history. And as David Ensor reports, U.S. officials apparently have already made real progress.
U.S. officials say on the passenger manifests of the hijacked planes used in the attacks, they found names associated with terrorist groups. Intelligence officials say the evidence still points to the Al-Qaeda group, headed by Osama bin Laden.
There had to be some brains behind this. We have some good, promising leads. They're obviously being followed.
Publicly, the Bush administration is accusing no one so far, while warning nations they too will pay for any help given to those who attacked New York and Washington.
We will hold accountable those countries that provide support, that give host nation, if you can call it that, support and facilities to these kinds of terrorist groups.
Afghanistan's Taliban government has long offered haven to bin Laden, but U.S. officials say they have no evidence thus far of any state directly assisting the attacks in New York and Washington. Many analysts argue that such a coordinated broadside could not have been possible without it.
Osama bin Laden represents a complete terrorist network. He will have one or more state sponsors, countries that he's either based in or working in collusion with. There'll have been passport support, communication support.
One thing I think that ought to make us a bit suspicious about whether bin Laden was involved in it alone or not is that he goes to great lengths to advertise himself. And when you see something like that, you begin to wonder whether or not there may be an effort to draw our attention solely to him, to the neglect of someone who may be his principal contractor.
If there was state support, a number of terrorism experts point to Iraq as the most likely suspect. A statement from President Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television said, quote, "The United States reaps the thorns that its rulers have sown in the world."
U.S. officials say they are developing good law enforcement and intelligence leads. They do not know yet who was behind these attacks, nor whether any state assisted them. But they believe they soon will. David Ensor, CNN, Washington.
The U.S. military says it's assuming a defensive posture along both coasts of the United States to protect its borders. For more on that, we go live now to the Pentagon and CNN's Mark Potter. Mark?
Well, John, activity is still afoot here at the Pentagon. It's quiet at this hour, but the building is still very operational. Lots of things going on, and we're told that it will be fully operational later today. All available personnel are expected to report to work despite the damage to the building, which we are seeing a live picture of right now. In this area destroyed by the airplane attack, workers continue to sift through the rubble and to try to shore up the structure so they can go deeper into the building. They're looking for victims, and they say they don't expect to find any survivors. The anticipated death toll here is in the area of 200, including those who died in the plane. Now, we have a graphic that we would like to show you, if we could, showing the area hit by the plane and affected by the very intense fire. Fully half of the entire Pentagon complex, as we can see here, is shut down now, and the corridors leading to those areas are blocked by armed guards. Ironically, the area hit by the plane had just been renovated. Now, officials say it could take months, if not years, to repair the damage to the building. Thousands of people here have been displaced, including the chiefs of the Navy and the Army. They will all have to work out of temporary offices now. In a recorded message to the U.S. troops, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld once again hinted at upcoming military retaliations.
It is my duty as head of this department to tell you that more, much more, will be asked of you in the weeks and months ahead. This is especially true of those who are in the field. We face powerful and terrible enemies, enemies we intend to vanquish, so that moments of horror like yesterday will be stopped.
Now, here at the Pentagon, FBI agents also are on scene, sifting through the rubble, looking for evidence that would support a criminal case. Officials are also looking for the black boxes from the plane, the voice and the cockpit recorders, and they believe that there could be information on those boxes if they are found that could provide important information on exactly how this attack was planned, and perhaps could answer the question of whether the hijackers actually intended to attack the White House before turning the plane toward the Pentagon. That's a report, a suggestion coming out of the White House, which says it has credible information to that effect. Again, those black boxes have not yet been found. Back to you.
Mark, there are warships now up and down both coasts of the United States, west and east. It's an impressive display of gunboat diplomacy or something. Is it symbolic, or do they really expect still some kind of attack to come by sea?
Well, U.S. military officials say that those ships along the east and west coast are there in a defensive posture, particularly when talking about the east coast. They say the ships there are to protect particularly the areas of New York City and Washington, D.C., against further airborne attacks. There are 2 carriers and support ships, 5 support ships on the East Coast, 1 carrier and 14 warships on the West Coast and in the area of Hawaii. It is a symbolic gesture on the one hand, but it does have an important defensive position, and it does represent a concern on the part of the U.S. military.
Let me ask you about something else that we just heard from the Secretary of Defense, who described the U.S. facing what he called a powerful and terrible enemy. When the Secretary of Defense of a nation as powerful as this one uses that kind of language, who's he talking about?
He's talking about the terrorists, the international terrorists, people who are willing to die in the furtherance of their goals, a very difficult enemy to fight. That's exactly what he's talking about, and he's bracing the troops for the possibility that they may have to go into action.
Mark Potter at the Pentagon, thanks very much. Milica.
Secretary of State Colin Powell says he's building a strong coalition of international support as the United States considers its response to the attacks. He also had words for Pakistan, which has a close relationship with Afghanistan, where suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden is thought to be hiding.
We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack. But we thought, as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information.
The United States ambassador to Pakistan is in Islamabad. Wendy Chamberlain is to meet with Pakistani President General Pervez Musharraf Thursday. Earlier, Mr. Musharraf made a national address in which he pledged to cooperate with Washington.
Pakistan has been extending cooperation to international efforts to combat terrorism in the past and will continue to do so in the future. Countries must join hands in this common cause. I wish to assure President Bush once again and the United States government of our unstinted cooperation in the fight against terrorism.
In Afghanistan, the fear of possible attacks by the United States and its allies has residents and international aid workers fleeing the country. The United Nations and International Red Cross have already pulled some personnel out. Our Nick Robertson is in Kabul, Afghanistan, and he joins us from there by video phone. Nick.
A little while ago, 3 United Nations flights left the capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, for Pakistan. On board the last of the international United Nations staff here in Afghanistan. Before they left, they paid off all their employees and taken away key documents with them. Also today, representatives from the International Committee of the Department is fueling among the population in Kabul, parts of Afghanistan, what could be expected in this. They are concerned that Afghanistan could be targeted as some kind of on the United States. The Taliban yesterday issued a dire request, in fact, unusual for the leadership to issue of this nature, appealing to the United States judgment is appealed for that they hoped would prevail in the United States. They explained that Afghanistan was very poor and that Afghanistan would not the Afghan people. Likewise, they attacking the Taliban and killing the Taliban. It would not help Afghanistan.
Nick, thank you. Unfortunately, we apologize for the technical glitches. They were not able to hear Nick Robertson very well. We will try to get him a little later to talk to him again. Rescue workers in New York say the search effort is a painstaking process. Debris is being removed by handful and searched for anything of significance.
Everyone has the hopes of finding yet another survivor. They're digging deep and they're digging hard, looking, but again, it's being done by hand. The iron workers that are working in there are working to remove the steel, of which is on top of a lot of the bodies. Sifting through the debris, a lot of the body parts and the debris are one and the same. It's just becoming, right now, at this point, foul. The smell is starting to come from the dead. So the bodies are a little bit easier to identify at this point, although it's going to be a long, long process.
A pall hangs over the desperate search for survivors in New York. Hundreds of the surrounding buildings are damaged, some near collapse. 5 survivors were pulled from the mountain of wreckage on Wednesday, and rescue workers plod on through the night, hoping others are still alive. Garrick Utley joins us now live from New York with some thoughts. Garrick.
Yes, really. So we want to look at how the United States, how the Americans are doing, coping with the stress, the aftermath of these terrorist attacks. It's been said, of course, as we all know, that adversity is a very good test of character. And if we use that scale, there's nothing more adverse than what this country has been going through these last couple of days. And look at the response. Yes, there was the understandable chaos around the towers, the World Trade Center, when they came tumbling down. But after that, there was order, there was discipline. There's been no looting reported in the city when that could have happened. People are volunteering in long lines to donate their blood. There was on Wednesday evening one bomb alert, a hoax, but one so far. That's was perhaps to be expected. But above all, what's been impressive is the way people have pulled together to volunteer, to contribute, to give wherever and however they can. Here is a report from CNN's Brian Palmer.
A steady procession snakes south toward the smoke and wreckage of the World Trade Center. Police, firefighters, National Guard, and volunteers, hundreds of volunteers from all over the country. Clergy.
Well, I'm here to give any assistance that I can, for both the living and the dead.
Doctors and nurses.
We're from Texas. We're headed to help out.
Nursing assistant Cheryl Herring drove down from Massachusetts.
We've been taking care of the firefighters as they come in with exhaustion, giving them water, cleaning out their eyes, taking their vital signs.
An estimated 1,700 people have been treated at New York hospitals, with 150 doctors doing triage alone. The New York Red Cross is fielding 350 disaster response volunteers and 500 mental health professionals to help New Yorkers cope. U.S. companies are pitching in too. Cisco Systems is donating $4 million and General Electric $10 million to families of emergency workers. Iron workers join the effort, like Joe Mooney, who helped build the Trade Center towers.
What's your reaction to all this, Mr. Mooney?
I'm sick.
They crossed paths with weary men and women headed home for a few hours sleep or simply to a clear patch of sidewalk. And they passed bewildered and shell-shocked residents.
It's frightening to think, is this the beginning of what other people have been going through all over the world for decades and decades?
Firefighter John McAllister headed back to the carnage after already putting in 24 hours.
Heading down there and maybe help get some guys out.
I am saddened, outraged, disappointed, overjoyed by the camaraderie and the amazing effort, the coming together of New Yorkers.
Bill Cook is a retired detective.
I just couldn't stand to watch it on TV and not be a part of it. So I called my chief, and I was part of this unit 3 years ago, and I said, I got to do something.
But amidst the sadness, some reasons to rejoice. Port Authority police found one of their lost officers alive in the rubble.
I was extremely happy, and someone had asked me that earlier, and I compared it to the birth of my children.
It was like having a life come into my life. And when they found them, it was just, we were great. We were happy.
And signs just a few blocks north that life in New York has not been totally disrupted. But things have changed for New Yorkers. Parents asked the media to stay out of the park to avoid upsetting the children. Brian Palmer, CNN, New York.
Well, if the camera was kept out of that playground in New York City, you may have noticed something else. The media so far has been kept away from the immediate ground zero where the rescue efforts are underway, the attempts to recover any survivors or otherwise the victims, expect to be the thousands of victims in the wake of this terrorist attack. Now, you might ask or wonder, why is this? Well, one reason, of course, is that there's so many media, so many camera teams that they're allowed in there. If we were allowed in there, we'd be swarming all over the place and might well interfere with the recovery efforts. That's a judgment called by city officials. There also may be a second factor at work, the fact that perhaps hundreds or thousands of bodies will be recovered. And is that an image people really want to see? Is it images people should be seeing? That debate hasn't really started, but we will see whether we are going to see it in the weeks and the months to come. Relitza, back to you.
Difficult times to come yet. Garrick, thank you very much.
The scene outside the Pentagon is one of dueling emotions. Relatives have expressed anguish and hope as they keep vigil, and emergency crews search for between 100 and 200 people missing. Sheila Cast has been speaking to some of those people waiting.
The second terrorist attack was a direct hit on the office space of Morgan Stanley. The firm had 3,500 workers in 22 floors, almost exactly in the area where the second plane hit. But incredibly, most of those employees had already fled the tower minutes before the explosion.
Miraculously, I'd say, we had 2,500 people in World Trade Center 2.
Our apologies, that was not the report that Sheila Cast prepared, but we do have that for you now.
Tracy Rowenhorst stands vigil as close as she can to the spot where the jet slammed into the Pentagon. She looks for any movement, any relevant detail. On Tuesday, her husband Edward, an accountant for the Army, was working near that spot.
I feel I need to be here with him. If he's alive, then he'll definitely need me when he comes out.
It is a frustrating but not lonely vigil. Eddie's parents and the best friends and neighbors who knew him even before he married Tracy 10 years and 2 kids ago keep each other's hopes up with wisecracks and jokes. That's what Eddie would do if he were with them, they say.
I'm trying to be incredibly focused. If I don't, then I would be hysterical. And right now I don't need to be there. I need to be here, watching, waiting.
Officials say the best prospects for finding survivors are at the edges of the impact zone, where the smoke and the heat may not have been as intense. The husband of one who has survived keeps his own vigil at a hospital across town.
You can still see smoke wafting up from the Pentagon.
As soon as the first pictures flashed onto television, even though it was only Louise Kurtz's second day on the job, her husband Michael started to worry. Hours later, the hospital phoned.
I came in teary-eyed. I didn't recognize my wife of 31 years. She's doing better. She's got 70% burns on her body.
Back at what Tracy Rowenhorst calls ground zero, touched by an occasional prayer, she intends to keep her vigil.
We're just sitting in limbo until they start bringing bodies out, I guess. Either way, dead or alive. And we'll be here until the very... If he's the last one out, we'll be here until he comes out.
Sheila Cast for CNN, Washington.
The attacks have left many people psychologically scarred and many others in need of grief counseling. For more on this aspect of this tragedy, we're joined from London by grief counselor Colin Grange. Mr. Grange, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, this is an unprecedented attack, a new form of terrorism. Is this a challenge for you as you try to counsel the victims?
Oh, indeed. One of the major problems, of course, is just the sheer enormity of what happened and how it happened on TV and at several layers. The first airplane into the Twin Tower, the second, and then of course the towers themselves collapsing. So we're trying to, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
We're trying to provide support to the employees of the major investment banks, airlines who are suffering over here in London because they have lost colleagues, and of course they're very familiar with the buildings and so on, and they really need help overcoming feelings of disbelief, deep sadness, shock, and of course anger, which is covering up many other emotions of hurt.
So how do you help them? What do you tell them?
Well, we provide a telephone support service 24 hours a day to all the employees of our client organisations, and we help them talk through their feelings either over the phone. We're also providing professionals on site in these organisations so that if anybody wants to come along and talk about their feelings, we can help them. We're really trying to help our organisations go through a really quite a fine line of trying to keep things as normal as possible, which can help people keep structure to their lives over here working in London, but also to acknowledge the deep distress and sadness that there is around the employees.
What about those who have not lost loved ones, those who were just in New York, they witnessed it, but they were not directly impacted by it? How do they deal with the sense of vulnerability that they will feel for a long time, and just the horror of what happened and what has forever scarred their city?
Well, it will take a long time for many people who witnessed the event. Again, a strong sense of disbelief is around, simply because it was almost like watching a movie. The only time you see that level of destruction is when you're looking at a motion picture where it's all special effects. So the disbelief, I believe, would still be strong in a lot of people, and it will take some time to come to terms with all the fear and distress and sadness that's been experienced. Obviously, we at Ceridian provide services worldwide, and that includes providing services to some of the victims and the people immediately involved in New York, as well as the services we provide over here in London.
You say you help people come to terms, but can people really come to terms with what happened in New York?
Yes, it's obviously going to be a very significant event in their lives, and it will never be forgotten. But we have learned over the last 10 or 15 years of how we can support people experiencing these kinds of traumatic experiences. We can help them talk through the feelings that they have, what they may be experiencing, such as sleeplessness, a high level of anxiety, being very jumpy, reliving the experience by having images of what happened. And we have developed ways of managing these incidents right from the beginning, providing proactive help to people relatively soon after the event, 2-3 days, right through to providing post-traumatic counselling for people who have symptoms that don't start to recover after a few weeks.
Are there symptoms that come about later? As you say, people are now in shock, in disbelief.
Well, that can happen, of course. I mean, many people who are physically injured probably won't experience the full psychological impact until their physical injuries have recovered to some extent. And again, many people may not experience the full trauma until later on. Some people can seem to go on as normal for several weeks, and then they might start experiencing psychological problems. Again, everybody's different, and it will depend on how they react. Again, some other people may not have been directly involved in the incident, but they may have previous traumatic experiences reawakened, especially as what has happened was so visible. They were watching it on the news as it happened, and that may well force and cause them to re-experience previous traumas in their lives.
Mr. Grange, thank you very much. John.
Thank you.
A moment ago, we showed you a portion of a taped report by mistake, but it's a remarkable story well worth seeing. A well-known investment bank was headquartered at the World Trade Center. Its staff might have been easy victims for the 2 planes which flew into the Twin Towers. But as Peter Viles reports, managers at Morgan Stanley Dean Witter are counting their blessings.
The second terrorist attack was a direct hit on the office space of Morgan Stanley. The firm had 3,500 workers in 22 floors, almost exactly in the area where the second plane hit. But incredibly, most of those employees had already fled the tower minutes before the explosion.
Miraculously, I'd say, we had 2,500 people in World Trade Center 2, 1,000 people in World Trade Center 5. It appears the vast majority got out safely.
A miracle made possible by the firm's split-second decision to evacuate the South Tower immediately after the North Tower was hit.
We have a lot of stories of courage, a lot of stories of compassion, and we're going to be fine.
Wall Street is a tough business where it's often said the only thing that matters is the bottom line. That is not true today. The thing that matters most to these companies is finding out exactly how many of their employees are alive today. Peter Viles, CNN Financial News, New York.
As well as the appalling human cost, there are many more implications, including the impact on the global economy. Richard Quest joins us now from London with an update on business. Richard?
Many thanks indeed, Jonathan. Yes, the European Central Bank is meeting in Frankfurt around now to discuss how best to limit the economic impact of the attack that was seen in New York. Many people believe that the ECB will make some sort of gesture and perhaps reduce European interest rates. The idea, once again, to try and rebuild confidence, to provide liquidity not only to the markets but also to consumers who may, of course, have been frightened off by what they saw. It seems to be a split view on whether the ECB will actually cut rates. They did so last month, and the last word from the ECB president was that that probably wasn't necessary. We'll have that decision for you in around 3 hours' time. To the markets that have been trading in the Asian trading day, also on currency rates, the Japanese yen trading at 119 to the US dollar, the euro at 90 US cents, the pound at 146.52. What we've seen there is some dollar strength coming back into the markets. In Asia, when trading was finished for the session, Japan's Nikkei average actually was up a touch at the close of the day. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng was also up, in that case up more than 1%, although Hong Kong had suffered quite sharply lower in the previous day, and Singapore was down 1%. On the European markets, because business is well and truly underway, the London FTSE up around 0.5%, the DAX 0.75% in Frankfurt, waiting for the ECB decision, while the CAC in Paris is basically flat. That's the way the financial world outside the United States is looking at the moment. Maggie Lake now joins us to bring us up to date with what's happening in New York. Maggie?
Richard, we're getting ever closer to morning here, and as the bond market is reopening, we wait for stocks perhaps Friday, Monday at the latest to open. There are a few major questions facing the markets. The first is, will this event push the U.S. economy into recession? We have been limping along. Perhaps this is the straw, some people saying, that breaks the camel's back and pushes us into negative territory. Another big question, will it crack consumer confidence, cause people to pull back on spending and start selling stocks, especially near term? And finally, what can the Federal Reserve do? They are providing liquidity. Will they also cut interest rates immediately, as some have suggested and recommended that they do? Now, these are enormous questions, and just want to offer a couple of thoughts on some sentiment coming out from analysts and market watchers today. First of all, in terms of the threat of recession, obviously the business disruption is going to be massive, and no one is pretending it is not going to hurt profits of many companies. But analysts are saying once we get back that, Diane Swank, once speaking today, saying although it's a disaster and great tragedy, ironically, after the initial disruption, The economy often sees a spurt in economic activity. We are a country that rebuilds, and we will. We've already seen the government talking about a package of maybe up to $20 billion. Spending on defense is expected, security. So there will be some stimulus there. Also, in terms of the consumer, we may see some initial selling, some initial panic or jitters, but a lot of people are offering the suggestion that perhaps people will rally around and actually buy stocks in a show of support for the country. People's sort of spirits galvanized. We're hearing a lot of that sentiment come out from people on the street, a lot of patriotic feeling. It is a possibility. It's a very emotional time. It's not clear that that will happen, but we certainly are hearing a lot about that possibility, and not just from individual investors, even from the institutional side. There was a bond trader from PIMCO talking today, and he was asked if they will be selling into the market tomorrow, and his response was that we will trade, but we are not going to aggressively try and exploit this situation. We are bond traders, but we are first and foremost citizens. So there are an awful lot of questions. It is not clear by any means what the outcome is. People should not assume it will all be negative, and a lot of officials and advisors are cautioning people to be patient and calm as we work through some of these questions. Jonathan, back to you.
Maggie Lake, thanks very much. A different bit of business now, a word to our viewers. Ordinarily, you'd be seeing CNN Newsroom, our daily educational program for the classroom at this time. CNN Newsroom will not be seen today or tomorrow, but will return on Monday with a special program focusing on the attacks on the U.S. We'll look at the events of this week, look at the history of terrorism, and talk with young people about how they've been affected. In the meantime, teachers can find educational materials relating to the attacks, focusing on how to talk with young people about the situation on our educational website. That's cnnfyi.com.
There has been quick action on Capitol Hill should the U.S. ever find those responsible for Tuesday's atrocities. House lawmakers followed the Senate's lead in passing a resolution vowing retaliation. Kelly Wallace is in Washington. She joins us now with more on what's going on in the nation's capital. Kelly.
Well, Relitza, a big focus for the Bush administration is laying the groundwork for a possible military response, working with Congress and also using diplomatic channels. First, as you mentioned, a Congress, the White House asking lawmakers to pass a resolution authorizing the use of force to retaliate for the 4 deadly terrorist attacks. There you see a live picture of the U.S. Capitol at this time. Now, we do know from senior officials that the White House and lawmakers have been negotiating over the wording of such a use of force resolution, some comparing it to the resolution passed by Congress back in 1991, giving President Bush's father the authority to use force after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Some other congressional leaders expressing some concern that such a resolution could, in essence, give Mr. Bush a blank check to use military action. Now, on another front, not as controversial, Congress expected to get a bill to the president's desk possibly as early as this day, authorizing $20 billion in emergency aid to help with search and rescue efforts, as well as to help with the rebuilding in these communities that have been affected by these attacks, and of course to aid federal, state, and local agencies. Relitza, of course, the feelings here still tremendous sadness, flags throughout the nation's capital at half-staff, and we saw a prayer vigil last night. It began at the U.S. Capitol. There were people holding candles, carrying American flags, and some people singing, we understand, God Bless America, walking from the U.S. Capitol and then proceeding to Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. Now, on the diplomatic front, President Bush has been reaching out to world leaders to build what the White House is calling an international coalition against terrorism. Mr. Bush on Wednesday talking to the leaders of Canada, Britain, France, Germany, China, and Russia. Also, Relitza, the administration quite gratified by NATO's statement, which said that an attack on one member of the alliance is the same as an attack on the alliance. Now, on Wednesday, Mr. Bush had 2 separate meetings with his national security team, more meetings with his key advisors likely on this day. Again, U.S. officials publicly not commenting about who they think is responsible for these attacks, but privately, senior officials saying that the evidence is certainly looking and pointing to affiliates of accused terrorist Osama bin Laden. Relitza?
Kelly, thank you. The Tuesday's devastating attacks came against the wealthiest, best defended country in the world, only added to the shock and amazement Though the United States blazes its own trail in international diplomacy, Washington is now courting support for any possible response against the perpetrators. Andrea Koppel reports.
With much of the nation focused on the tragedy at home, Secretary of State Colin Powell set his sights overseas, taking the helm in U.S. diplomatic efforts to build international support against terrorism.
We're building a strong coalition to go after these perpetrators, but more broadly, to go after terrorism wherever we find it in the world. It's a scourge not only against the United States, but against civilization, and it must be brought to an end.
10 years ago, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Gulf War, then General Powell helped build the coalition against Iraq. But this time the victim is the United States, and the enemy still unknown. Nevertheless, Powell has already begun to lay the groundwork for an eventual military retaliation in phone calls with leaders in Israel, the Palestinian territories, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Powell also reached out to the European Union, as well as the Arab League, United Nations, and the NATO military alliance, which for the first time in its history Wednesday invoked a clause in the NATO Charter obligating all members to assist if one is attacked.
It's like dropping a stone in the middle of a pond and you have ripples rippling out. And we start with ourselves, then we go to our closest allies in Europe through NATO, and we show the world that this time there are none of the usual divisions between us and the Europeans in regard to this region.
Secretary Powell also sent stern warnings to Pakistan, a neighbor and supporter of Afghanistan's Taliban militia, accused of harboring suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden. The message? The U.S. expects complete cooperation in finding those responsible for Tuesday's attacks. Next week, Powell plans to send his deputy to Moscow for a special meeting with Russian officials on Afghanistan. Secretary Powell working every possible diplomatic angle, telling the international community, in the words of OneAid, you're either with us or against us. Andrea Koppel, CNN, at the State Department.
Many British citizens are believed to be among the victims of the New York attacks. Prime Minister Tony Blair immediately condemned them, offering help to find those responsible. But what kind of role might Britain and the rest of Europe take in the search for suspects? Joining us live from London is CNN's European political editor, Robin Oakley. Robin?
Jonathan, I've just been talking to Jack Straw, the British Foreign Secretary at the Foreign Office, and the first response from him was that the British public, certainly, and many people across Europe, have taken this attack on the United States as if it was an attack on them. He was saying that many British citizens work in the United States, many US citizens work in Britain and in Europe. There is a real sense of solidarity about this. But when I said to him, look, you and Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, are talking about standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, what does that really mean? Does it merely mean moral support? He said, no, it clearly means military support.
NATO is not just about an expression of moral support. NATO is about providing tangible military support. That is the point. That is what Article 5 is about. If you're asking me to speculate on the nature of that military or intelligence support, I can't, but Secretary of State Colin Powell gave some indication of the kind of support for which the United States might be looking to if they decide on particular military actions.
There are, of course, some worries in Europe about what kind of level of response America might choose to make once the perpetrators are identified and once it has a target to strike back at. Mr. Straw said to me that that is a question that will be discussed between America and America's NATO allies, the level of support. And the intelligence communities, he said, of the UK and the US are in constant touch with each other. But when I said there were some worries in Europe that perhaps too big a response from the United States at this time might lead to a perpetuation of terrorism, that maybe the right response was not necessarily an eye for an eye, Mr. Straw said, no, there were dangers in the alternative response to that, and you simply could not make it a case, it could not be a case of turning the other cheek, as it were.
I'm sitting in the British Foreign Office. It's not more than 50 yards away from 10 Downing Street. I remember the day in the early 90s when the Provisional IRA mortared Downing Street and tried to take out the cabinet. I remember 1984 when they bombed the hotel in Brighton in Sussex and almost killed Margaret Thatcher, the then Democratic elected Prime Minister. And it wasn't about retribution, but in each case, the attack on the terrorists, the need to take very firm action against those terrorists, as well as political action to undermine their support, was very necessary. And unless there had been action taken of a firm kind against those terrorists, I have to say there would never have been a peace process in Northern Ireland.
So that's a very clear message, Jonathan, coming certainly from the UK, and we're likely to hear much the same from the rest of NATO. They have invoked Article 5. This action, this terrorist action against the United States, has been taken as an attack against all members of NATO, and the response will be an appropriate one. Jonathan.
Is there any sign of military preparation in the United Kingdom? People are clearly using words like war and retribution. Are they getting ready for something there?
Difficult to assess that at the moment, Jonathan, because Jack Straw and other ministers, when you start pressing for military or intelligence detail, immediately clam up. But they certainly admit to a high state of military preparedness. I'm quite certain that preparations are going on, but I think the expectation is not of absolutely immediate action. Jonathan.
Robin Oakley, thanks very much.
As Americans grieve, some images from other parts of the world surprise, even shock. Palestinians celebrating the terrorist attacks, other Arabs scolding U.S. policies. CNN's Cairo Bureau Chief Ben Wiedemann explains where some of the anti-U.S. anger comes from.
A group of Palestinians celebrate at the news of the attacks in New York and Washington. Other Palestinians, including those who held a vigil outside the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, say such sentiments do not represent the majority. But few in the region deny they share a growing sense of anger and frustration with U.S. policy in the Middle East, where, over the years, the U.S. has managed to gain the bitter enmity of millions. For decades, Arabs have been critical of America's substantial diplomatic, economic, and military support for Israel, while many believe the U.S. has turned a blind eye to Palestinian demands that Israel leave Arab land.
You know, the anti-American feeling is very high now in the Middle East and the Muslim world because what's happening on the occupied territories, and many people accuse the United States of actually helping the Israeli and protecting them.
Since the outbreak of the Palestinian uprising nearly a year ago, anger at the United States has increased dramatically. Alarmed at growing anti-American sentiment, traditional U.S. allies in the region, including Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, have warned that American interests are at risk if the U.S. doesn't modify its Mideast policy. Another source of bitterness, Iraq. For more than a decade, Washington has insisted upon maintaining harsh United Nations economic sanctions, officially intended to target the regime of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. Yet many blame the sanctions for causing the deaths of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Iraqis from disease and malnutrition. Elsewhere, Washington has been the most vocal advocate of economic and political sanctions against Libya, Sudan, Iran, and Afghanistan, all predominantly Muslim countries. The day the Muslim countries unite, says this Pakistani, Russia and the U.S. will flow away like a gust of water. You can't blame Palestine or anyone else. It's a natural destruction. You've asked for it. Responsibility for Tuesday's massive terror attack has yet to be determined, but few in the Mideast doubt the depth of anger and hatred toward the United States. Ben Wiedemann, CNN.
A moment ago, we heard from Britain. All 15 countries, though, of the European Union have pledged their support for the United States at an emergency meeting in Brussels. And in a separate meeting, NATO has declared the hijack attacks an assault against all NATO member states. Diana Muriel joins us now from Brussels with the latest there. Diana?
Yes, Jonathan, here in Brussels today, NATO will continue their meetings today. No press conferences are planned, but Lord Robertson, the Secretary-General of NATO, is still in Brussels, and we hope to be speaking to him on CNN later in the day. Interestingly, last night, the reason why the decision from NATO came so late on the ratification of Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington, where all member states agreed that an attack on one member was an attack on them all, the reason it was so late was because the Belgian Parliament held a debate here in Brussels. They hold the presidency of the European Union, and there were some concerns and some objections raised by some of the Belgian political parties, particularly the Green parties and the Socialists, about the wording of the communique that NATO was going to issue. The particular problem was over the use of the phrase act of war to describe the attacks in Washington and New York. They have modified the language, and in fact, if you read the communique carefully, you will see at the end they describe it as an act of barbarism. And this was a compromise that was made yesterday here in Brussels. The Parliament demanded the suspension of the NATO ambassadors' meeting until they could agree the wording, and that is why Lord Robertson spoke so late last night to ratify the Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington. Jonathan.
Article 5 has never been invoked before, and so this is something for historians to be watching. But in practical terms, is it clear what NATO is being asked to do now, what it is prepared to do?
No, it is not absolutely clear, Jonathan. What will happen is, as Robin Oakley was explaining, and indeed as Jack Straw was explaining in that interview that you saw just a moment ago, they need to identify the target specifically. Once that is done, then each individual NATO member will make a decision as to what level of participation they will provide to the effort. There are, of course, some hawks, Britain amongst them, and Germany also considered a hawk, and some doves, particularly Belgium and France. Belgium, of course, in the Gulf War did not send soldiers. They sent military experts who are experts in mines. They sent F-16 fighters, but Belgium is not expected, one of the countries not expected to send soldiers should this develop into some sort of military operation. Jonathan.
Diana Muriel in Brussels, thanks very much. All this because of what has happened in the United States and in New York at its most destructive, where the skyline is ravaged. People find neighbors and loved ones now dead. Grief, anger, and a strong sense of solidarity are replacing the first shock. We return to Garrick Utley in New York, where people of a battered city are coming to grips with the horror of Tuesday's attack. Garrick?
Coming to grips, Jonathan, of course, but also the key question that we're hearing every day right now is, when is life going to return to normal in New York City? Silly question. When was life ever normal in this metropolis here with more than 7 million people? On Wednesday, there were some signs of some kind of normalcy returning, and on Thursday, there'll be even more milestones along that path. But we want to take a moment now and get a rather impressionistic look of how New Yorkers have been coping, how they've been coming back. These are people who are not at ground zero down there in lower Manhattan, but all over Manhattan today. Producer Bonnie Bertram and camera operator Dave Timko offer their view.
September 12th, 2001, New York, the day after the World Trade Center was attacked and collapsed. People are sticking closely to their cell phones, trying to get any news they can of what's happening.
He doesn't have any identification on him, and we certainly hope someone recognizes him. We've heard pleas like this all day long.
Still waiting to find out how many people are being rescued and what the situation is downtown.
75-cent. Hi, next. Can I help you? Very fast. Next.
Where are you visiting from?
From Spain.
From Spain?
We are so terrified, and we don't know if we can get home again and see our families.
Are you going to JFK today? Oh, he won't take you?
No, he can't go.
Yeah, I'm trying to. They think if they go out, they won't be able to get back into the cities. But I'm like Dorothy, the Wizard of Oz. I just want to get home. If I could click my heels and make it happen, I would do it. Is this your limo? Huh? Yes, it is. Are you taking it to the airport or somewhere?
We're taking it to Texas.
All the way to Texas?
Oh, yeah.
You're not flying, I think.
No. All the way to Texas. It's going to take 32 hours.
Who knows when they're going to open the airports again, and we could be here till Saturday or so we made the decision to go.
Even though they have their lights on, I'm pretty sure there's not going to be a performance tonight.
Tonight there is no show.
A matinee today?
No matinee today. Our next show is tomorrow night at 8 o'clock.
Just contact Telecharge. I believe your accounts have already been credited.
When did you buy your tickets?
4 months ago, maybe. My phone's from England.
it'll come to London.
So you might get a chance to see it again.
Eventually.
So Times Square, it seems pretty quiet today. It's usually much more packed than this. Theater matinees have been canceled. It's basically pretty calm.
It just it seems like everybody's walking around and dazing, just thinking about it.
Did you feel scared a little bit yesterday?
Not really. I felt it was, and I ran home and watched the news, and it was kind of scary about all those buildings falling.
You just feel this air in the city. It's different. People are more somber, I think, more contemplative.
So we're in Central Park, and we're at a place called Strawberry Fields, and there's a memorial here for John Lennon. And it always seems like in times of pain, New Yorkers tend to congregate here.
I knew someone who worked there, so it's been difficult. He's missing. We don't know.
You haven't heard anything yet?
No, but I don't have a good feeling about it. So it's just sad.
Well, imagine what's coming up now. To answer some of the questions there, if returning to normal in New York City means that Times Square will be filled and the theaters will be open, they will be filled and open on Thursday evening, not far from here up in Times Square. If return to normal life means schools being open, filled with students, yes, they will be open tomorrow. If normalcy in New York City means being able to ride the subway system, this vast mass transportation system, yes, the subways will be running tomorrow, all the lines except one, which is, a minor detail, the C line. Jonathan, guess who rides the C line? Back to you.
Garrett Gutley, thanks very much.
NATO has declared the attacks to be an assault against all its 18 members. As we reported, for the first time in more than 5 decades, the alliance has invoked Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says if one member of state is under attack, all others will defend it. For more on what that might involve, we're joined now by Pío Cabanillas, Chief Government Spokesman for a key NATO ally, Spain. Mr. Cabanillas, thank you very much for joining us. What did it take for Spain to take this decision?
You're very welcome. Let me state our position very clearly. We are on your side. We are on your side because you're friends, because you're allies, because we share the same values, because we believe in democracy, because we believe in human rights, because we are sure that terrorism is the greatest threat to democracy and to the international community, and because we suffer terrorism ourselves. We know what you're going through. We go through that too. Again, we are on your side.
Mr. Cabanillas, there are 2 military bases in Spain that were used during the Gulf War. Will you allow the United States to make use of them should there be a decision made for retaliation?
Well, you know that there is a procedure to be completed. First, for the application of Article 5, it has to be demonstrated, that's what the declaration said yesterday, it has to be demonstrated that there is an attack, an armed attack coming from abroad. And then each country has the right to determine in which way they contribute to the common cause. Of course, talking and in close contact to all other allies and, of course, in close contact to the United States. So the Spanish contribution would be determined in due course. What I want to make very clear from now is that we are very much in favor of what is being discussed right now.
When President Bush visited earlier this year, he visited during his European trip, he actually started his European trip in Spain. Did he and Prime Minister Aznar talk about Basque terrorism?
I think that first and the most important thing they did is to recognize that terrorism was an international problem and that the only way to defend ourselves against that is international unity. He was very generous to the Spaniards, and we appreciate that very much. He stood side by side with us. Today, we stand side by side with you. They did talk, they have been talking, and I'm sure that we will both contribute to the fight we're all into.
Mr. Cabanillas, thank you very much. And here we pass the baton to our colleagues Carol Lynn and Vince Cellini. I'm Relitza Vasilova.
And I'm Jonathan Mann. We leave you with the scene outside the White House Wednesday night.